township in Durban. And I have in fact been involved in a variety of projects, particularly thinking about how young South Africans come to know and understand history and histories of the South African context in their own lives. So potentially I'll insert some other findings and things in the paper. But mostly I'm going to be speaking about mothers and grandmothers' stories today. And so by focusing particularly on intergenerational talk within families, I'm going to explore the ways that the past comes to be reconstructed and communicated indirectly by grandmothers for the next generation of young South Africans within a Durban township, and the implications this has for navigating lives in the present and the future. The recent historical political conflict and trauma is classically known through mechanisms of silence that mark discontinuities between the past and the present, on the one hand, and on the other, nostalgic reworking of more distant childhood pasts, which are actively constructed in the present. And in particular, generational talk in the stories that grandmothers tell about themselves and their experiences under apartheid will be explored to think about a living archive within multi-generational homes and families, and the questions it raises about whether the youth of contemporary South Africa can realistically be called born free. That term that we seem to like and use a lot. To unpack these realities, I focus on families as the primary sites where the transmission of such psychological legacies and in particular experiences of trauma can move or pass between the generations. And this approach foregrounds the ways in which the personal is political and highlights the importance of looking not only at macro state or community structures, but to more micro units of the family and the members within them to understand identity making after trauma. So in this research, I explore the stories grandmothers tell their grandchildren about their experiences under apartheid, and to explore generational talk and the silent legacies of violence and trauma that persist after apartheid. Narrative analysis offers insight into the workings of intergenerational trauma and memories in multi-generational homes. And the families who participated in the study all experienced a particular traumatic event, personally experiencing the political violence of apartheid. However, the study focuses on how this event has been integrated into and represented in family histories, how what is said and what remains unsaid within families functions and constitutes their identities in their ongoing lived experiences. Women's narratives, often considered secondary to the grand narratives of struggle and conflict, are drawn out to show the ways as primary caregivers they form the pivot for intergenerational transmission of secondary traumatization. And so, as you can see in the table and on the next one as well, participants were drawn from 6 multi-generational families in a Durban township, and they included 6 grandmothers, and we're going to speak about their stories. And they were identified by local political leadership as having experienced a specific direct personal trauma under apartheid, mostly the loss of a husband, a father, or a child during the 80s in the community. And a total of 17 hour-long interviews were conducted with participants in their homes in the community. And I'm exploring the stories that they share with their children and their grandchildren about what is said and what remains unsaid, and how these give way to reconstructions and articulations of trauma, sexuality and mothering, and in the stories that they're telling. The second generation who participated in the project were simply the children of the grandmothers who I interviewed, so either the children or grandchildren. And of course, in the South African context, poor black isiZulu-speaking mothers from a township continue to exist on the margins of who can speak and what can be known. And so by attempting to cross the multiple boundaries of inclusion, exclusion, including race, class and language, coming from a white suburban space myself, the project wades into the debate about whether you have to be one to know one. And the challenges inherent in boundary crossing necessitate an empathetic, engaged listener who is able to relinquish self in the quest to appropriate new truths. And in order to imagine worlds across lines of difference, we're tasked with a relinquishment of self. So not the sort of appropriation of popular culture, of taking on cultural tropes for one's own benefit, but rather of letting go of oneself, as Nkule speaks about appropriation, which is in fact a kind of self-sacrificing kind of appropriation, whereby we create the conditions for empathetic, internalized new meanings, and in this way listening functions to loop back on the listener by facilitating new understandings among researchers and practitioners, and in turn new opportunities for engagement and activism at the margins. And of course translation as well in this project served to reflect back on the limits of word equivalence and cultural meaning, as well as the embedded interpretive practices, power and privilege of who speaks for whom, and the entangled knowledge that produces. So the theory of intergenerational trauma which underpinned this project is a relatively recent psychological and social focus. Most of the research elaborating on it comes in fact from World War II, and there's reasons for us to complicate that and think about what that means. But nonetheless it foregrounds the family as the site of transmission of effects between generations, and so that continuities that exist between generations and across time demand us to think about the next generation not so much as removed across a chasm, but rather to think of what Hoffman in her work calls a hinge between generations, of living memory, of the fact that adults in society in fact still remember. This isn't a history that is so long ago that there is no living memory of it. Okay, this hinge is a useful metaphor for introducing talk about the psychology of the second generation, because it suggests that rather than a generational fissure, post-conflict societies are characterized by connections to and continuities with their conflictual histories, which are carried forward into the present and future. What is clear is that the family is the primary site for the transmission of first knowledge, the intimate or fairy tale knowledge that lays the foundation for any future understandings of self, of community, of history. Second, while silence is not the best mechanism for thinking about the transmission of received knowledges across the generations, it is the most common mechanism identified within intergenerational trauma theory. So it's not just about overt parenting practices, but also silence, which is the vehicle for the transmission of knowledge, and in particularly where children have not directly experienced traumatic events themselves. So this is referred to by many theorists as a kind of conspiracy of silence or cocoon of silence, in which ideas are transmitted between generations through what is left unsaid, through the way in which talk is obscured or masked. These silences within families also function as a way of communicating rules, myths, messages to which family may unquestionably adhere, and family members may come to know of parents' distress through silent, emotional and indirect channels. Parents themselves may also work to actively close off discussion around sensitive or emotional areas, and often in an attempt to protect their children precisely from the knowledge of what has happened to them. And thus families are described as in some ways colluding to maintain silences and to create protective factors. And it is because silence offers a protective function that it has become the primary site for thinking about the transmission of received knowledges across generations. This kind of silence, however, might best be understood as a kind of incomprehensibility, immeasurability that talk about the past contains. And so, as Mill writes, it is far too difficult for the children of survivors to imagine their parents as anything other than the severely traumatized people that the Holocaust in his writing made them into. Okay, third, this is about knowledge, and not just about experience or trauma or pathology. And so it's about knowing, even without direct talk. Hoffman, for example, in her work on the Holocaust, knows something happened, but she also does not know it, not experientially anyway. So the second generation is locked in this kind of paradox of feeling the weight of horrible events in their lives, but never quite knowing what happened or what it would be like to live through. Horrible events take on an amorphous presence, consuming or possessing the next generation precisely because they do not know and cannot know what their parents experienced. And this is particularly true when parents refuse to talk about events. However, even where such talk between generations happens, it takes this kind of amorphous quality, not defined by place or time, and lacking a beginning, middle, or end, and which is transmitted as an organizing principle to all succeeding generations. This organizing principle is akin to what we might call collective memory or knowledge. Okay. Walt makes the distinction between the generations with reference to a metaphorical suitcase. In the first generation, the suitcase is packed as survivors anticipate violence and disruption. The second generation move the suitcase to the hall, and in doing so recognize its presence but cannot grasp what is inside, cannot grasp its contents. It is only the third generation that the suitcase is unpacked and put away in the attic. If we think about the metaphorical suitcase as knowledge or memory of horrible events experienced by survivors, it is clear that silence is not the most helpful explanation for describing the transmission of intergenerational trauma. So while Hoffman notes a lack of direct communication about the Holocaust, she also suggests that other spaces for hearing and learning about the past were available. So in her knowledge of the past, she has some sense of the past to begin with, and the question of transmission then becomes not so much about the workings of silence, but about how and when and what the next generation are being told, and by who. Can and should the metaphorical suitcase be unpacked? And what are the consequences of that? If silence offers protection, the question remains, should generations talk? Should the next generations know? And if so, how do we unpack that suitcase without inflicting further harm? Right, so these are questions that I'm continually sort of facing and dealing with. Ironically, the many understandings of memory and trauma as the notion of loss or forgetting or silence, in the face of events that are difficult to make sense of, fail to cohere into clear and logical narratives of one's history and oneself, and ultimately the disintegration of individual and group identity. This is linked to the focus within psychological ideas and pathology around the sense that silence is a problem, and silence is pathological, and in fact the talking cure is the ideal within psychological theory. So this is complicated by conceptions of what can be said after trauma and the possibility for voice, resistance, and agency, as in Mutseme and others' views on silence, right? So psychology tends to view silence as, in a sort of sense of it being a lack, of it being some kind of absence that should be filled with talk. And that, in a sense, also speaks to the issues that Spivak raises about can the subaltern speak, and the sense that it coalesces with poverty and other kinds of experiences. But as we know from what Sema presented today and others, silence is much more than just a lack. It's got this kind of agency and force that is in fact full. It's not an empty space at all. So recognizing that silence can be an agentic strategy for coping with trauma, the notion of silence offered by Motsene, for example, is qualitatively different from the refusal to speak or the notion of voicelessness in the sense of a lack of opportunity for expression or the inability to speak, produced by trauma and mainstream psychology and its attempts to create voice. We think also of Stein's ignorance contract for those who know it. She speaks about whiteness and the way in which ignorance within the white community comes to, in fact, have socio-political underpinnings. Similarly, Parker, Plummer, and Andrews speak to what can be said, who can speak, and the power involved in that. Okay, I'm going to speak very quickly about some of my findings and move away from the notes because they're obviously quite long. But what I found with the women in the community that I spoke to, the mothers and grandmothers, is that there isn't direct talk between the generations about the trauma event. That they in fact just don't share what happened to them or to their family. But there is a community of knowing. So in fact there are other spaces in which that talk does happen, and kids know about those events through bigger, broader networks of talk. And this moment of connection during one of my interviews reveals some of that stuff. So the mother who participated in the project, at the moment of naming the very policeman who killed her son, calls to her daughter in the next room and says, "Was his name Smith?" And the daughter says yes, and then she asks it again. And in about 3 or 4 paragraphs of her talking, she repeats his name 7 times, checking. And she clearly knew, and the daughter clearly knew. And there was this clear sort of intergenerational moment of talk. So that kind of knowing is there, but they never sit down and actually share what that means or how that affects their family or any of that kind of stuff. What they do talk about is this stuff, however. So they talk about re-articulations of trauma, sexuality, and mothering. So the idea of reformulating what it means to be South African, reformulating what it means to be a woman in the face of violence, continued violence in the community, continued racism, the HIV scourge, gender violence. So those kinds of things are reformulated, and those are the things that they do then sit and talk very specifically about in the project. So I won't share that with you, I'll just go straight to the end, in which this project sort of underpins a bigger project, as I said, of understanding what's happening with young people and the way in which stories of the past have been articulated for them, and they've then adopted those into their own identity making for the past and the future, for the present and the future, sorry. And mothers certainly are participating in that, in these kinds of indirect communications, indirect intergenerational talk. In another project that I do specifically with young South Africans at schools in a township, rural and suburban community, a lot more of the race talk between generations is included, and how that stuff is re-articulated and reimagined for young South Africans. But ultimately reflecting on how, when and how stories of apartheid are said or remain unsaid, alerts us to the ways in which personal narratives and intergenerational storytelling are interweaving threads in a living archive within multi-generational homes. What can be said and who speaks is overlaid by methodological and ontological decisions linked to translation practices. Silence resists its role as psychological boogeyman in the ways it protects and rearticulates identity across time.
So our next presentation will be Lungelwa Phakathi, speaking on Agentic silence, rediscovering Margaret and Bessie against Maru. Go and make noise in this. Projector. You can switch off the projector.
Jeg faren vil.
Yeah.
Oddly positioned. Greetings, my learned friends. Presenting this paper is Lungelwa, the black crow with a snow white heart. Fly with me, and together let us rediscover Margaret in Bessie Maru. Margaret is an orphan of Khoisan descent. While Khoisan is the politically correct term to use for her tribe, the terms Musara and Basara will be used in this paper to retain the original context of the novel. From the minute she is born, Margaret is presented as a victim. To begin with, she is brought to life by a woman of the Basara tribe that is considered as inferior to Batswana. Then she is orphaned at birth. This leaves Margaret being an orphaned, nameless child from a nameless mother, thus erasing her identity, which complicates her already subjugated state as Musara. Following this erasure is her subsequent adoption by Mrs. Kedmo, who names Margaret after herself. The European name severs whatever ties that may have remained had Margaret been given a Musara name. It robs her of a sense of belonging, which renders her vulnerable to abuse later, as she has neither family nor tribe connections to fall back on for protection. It also leaves her lonely and starved for affection. As a child, Margaret is abused and taunted by other school children who do not understand how she can attend school with them being Musara. Although this stops after Mrs. Kedmo's intervention, it resurfaces in adulthood when she moves to Dilebe to begin her career as a school teacher. The main reason for Margaret coming across as a helpless victim is the fact that she does not vocally challenge her domination by her oppressors, nor does she rebel against it in a manner that demonstrates a direct challenge to her oppressors. This has led to some scholars, such as Yuma Ibrahim, concluding that her passivity does not make her a significant character to transformation, especially in relation to Basara's marginalization. Her argument unfolds as follows. Even though her marriage to Maru has been responsible for that wind of freedom blowing into the darkest corners of Masara oppression, it is not her actions that have done that, but rather her passive acceptance of somebody's actions, which always remain external to her. Ibrahim's reading of Margaret as passive is limiting in that it does not consider possible subversion in how Margaret reacts to domination. It seems that Ibrahim has a limited perspective on how victims react to oppression, and that is through direct challenge. A similar sentiment is shared by Isabella Matsikidze, who argues that Margaret, the oppressed, is given too passive a role in her liberation. It is such perceptions that necessitate rethinking about Head's depiction of female characters. While there is merit in the argument that Margaret tends to be passive, it is, however, limiting to erase her contribution to transformation simply because she is not aggressive and does not directly challenge her oppressors. In this paper, I shall examine the subversive aspects in the depiction of Margaret that have so far been omitted or under-interrogated. My focus will be on Margaret's tear, her silence, disruptive presence, trance, and dreams. I hope I get to all that. I shall expand on how these become her agentic tools. In her article, The Mead always speaks on women's silence as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Nthabiseni Mutsime indicates that women have created a new form of agency observed in women's articulation of their languages of pain and grief through the language of silence. Her interpretation of silence should not be read as being opposite to speech. Rather, she proposes that silence and speech be both considered as communication through a consideration of words, silence, dreams, gestures, tears, all existing interdependently and within the same interpretive field. It is from this perspective that I examine Margaret's seeming passivity. In Zulu we say, ingane ngakhali ifele embelekweni, which translated states that if a child does not cry, he or she will die on the mother's back. This means that one should indicate discomfort one way or another. This idiom resonates with Mutsime's stance on silence in that it recognizes crying as communication in the same way that a verbal protest would be. The idiom is applicable to Margaret. The fact that she is not always vocal about her subjugation does not mean that she accepts it. Her discomfort is indicated in various ways that I shall investigate. One manner in which Margaret reacts to oppression is through her tear, single tear. Mutsime already recognizes tears as a new form of female agency, and endorsing that, I further advance that it is a sign of reflexive agency. This is a form of agency which, according to Albert Bandura, is an automatic reflex to circumstances or context, rather than a pre-planned, calculated action. We first learn of this reaction when Margaret is taunted by children at school. Her helplessness and acceptance of her position is captured in the rhetorical question, what was a bushman supposed to do? According to Mutsime, when words are inadequate to express humiliation, the victim becomes important. This question is evidence of Margaret's importance. She feels so helpless that her automatic reflex is to cry in order to indicate her misery. Her tear is not pre-planned or calculated to serve as a weapon or induce protection. However, it prompts Mrs. Kedmo into defending her. Margaret does not make a conscious effort to seek protection, but her speech acts make people want to defend her. When she goes to Dilembe to assume her post, she is given a lift by a truck driver, Josh. When they reach her destination, she wants to go into the restaurant across the street to buy food, but because she's not used to fending for herself, she stands there petrified. Josh takes on the role of a temporary protector and comes to her aid. In this case, we learn that it was the stricken, helpless look on her face that so touched his heart. Even without saying anything, Margaret's silence, as Kanchana Ubabe argues, is a coded discourse that speaks more profoundly than words. Ubabe views silence in women's texts as a form of rebellion that can be overt or covert. In this instance, Margaret's silence should be read more as reflexive agency rather than rebellion. In her silence, her facial expression becomes her speech that communicates her anxiety to Josh, prompting him to be her protector by reassuring her not to be afraid and also ensuring that she is fed. Further signs of Margaret speaking without words can be observed in her relationship with Maru. At the beginning of the novel, Head introduces Margaret and Maru as a couple. While alluding to Margaret's victimhood as Musarwa and as a woman, signs of her agency emerge in how she copes with Maru's domination of her. The following excerpt is evidence of this emerging agency. So quietly did he enter the house that his wife looked up fearfully from her work of preparing the table for the evening meal. He sometimes had vicious, malicious moods when every word was a sharp knife intended to grind and regrind the same raw wound. Most certainly, no memory remained in her heart and mind of previous suffering. In this excerpt, we learn of Maru's oppressive moods, which render Margaret fearful. It is therefore ironic that when Maru's moods grind and regrind the same raw wound, Margaret has no memory of the constantly inflicted pain. The fact that Margaret is able to erase the memory points to her agentic silence. According to Mutsime, while women inhabited in some way supported certain apartheid structures that oppressed them, this did not cancel the fact that they were simultaneously engaged in the process of resisting them. While she refers to South African women during apartheid, the same can be said of heads women in patriarchy, that they can somehow endorse patriarchy, as Raffaella has argued. However, women can simultaneously be engaged in the process of subverting patriarchy. This is observed in Margaret, who abets patriarchy when she allows herself to be dominated, as in this example, while she simultaneously subverts it through her agency. When Margaret does not confront Maru about his mood swings, cowering in fear when he is in a vicious, malicious mood, this can be read as an endorsement of patriarchy. However, when we witness how she simultaneously simply erases the vicious moods from memory and dwells on the times when he showers her with love, the erasure from memory is not depicted as a conscious effort, but seems to be a coping mechanism for Margaret. This becomes somewhat subversive because it circumscribes Maru's domination, since whatever he does and whatever unpleasant statement he utters, Margaret will erase from memory, and it will have no place in her mind to oppress her after the speech or deed. This incident reveals how Margaret is paradoxically a victim and simultaneously an agent. The relationship between Margaret and Nkule becomes strong evidence of her agentic nature, albeit reflexive, which may explain why it may have been overlooked by some scholars. Without doing or saying anything, Margaret, through her transformative presence, affects Nkule in a significant manner. To better understand how Margaret affects Nkule's life, one has to first get to know how Nkule was before Margaret influenced him. The following extract gives some insight into his character. It captures an incident just after Margaret has met Nkule for the first time and he is driving her to where she will live. First, one goat jumped out of the road, then 6, 7, or 8 more. People jumped. People and goats looked outraged. He kept on smiling. He was royalty, the son of a chief. He'd grown up making goats and people jump. It was nothing. This extract reveals Nkule's inconsiderate nature. He has no regard for humans nor animals. By clubbing these two together, Head gives the reader the idea that he would have no better regard for women. If this is his attitude to fellow living things, this portrayal of Nkule as a devilish, self-centered character becomes important later when the transformation in him occurs. On the very next page in the text, we learn that when he spoke, she could hardly recognize his voice. It had deepened in a strange way. There was something sweet in it, like a note of music, yet he only uttered one word. Why? I'm afraid of scorpions, she said. He turned round slowly. I knew you were going to say that. He said as though he were talking to an old friend whose faults and failings were quite well known to him. But there was a trick to him, some shocking, unexpected magic. A moment ago, he had been a hateful, arrogant man. It is noteworthy that the very same man who has been depicted as an egocentric devil a while ago suddenly changes. He cares to know someone else's opinion. It is significant that Nkule has been in the presence of royalty such as Nkule all his life, yet his transformation begins simply by being in Margaret's presence for a few minutes, without her having said or done anything to reprimand him for his selfishness. Nkule's earlier mentioned inconsiderate nature gives that much validity to Margaret's agency because she is able to transform such a man. This is another indication of Margaret's reflexive agency, which I attribute to what Mackenzie refers to as the psychic plane on which Margaret, Maru, and Nkule connect. I advance that this mysterious connection is where Margaret's reflexive agency lies, as she does not consciously nor deliberately set to transform Nkule. It is also significant that where Nkule and other village women throw themselves at Nkule. In the relationship between Nkule and Margaret, it is Nkule who is establishing a bond between him and her by implying earlier acquaintanceship. A significant moment that seals their spiritual connection is when Margaret's heart goes bang. Nkule is described as someone without a heart before Margaret's arrival, and that is witnessed in how he relates to other living beings. Margaret is not the only one whose heart bangs, as we learn that something had gone bang inside his chest, and the woman had raised her hand to her heart at the same time. Therefore, when Margaret's heart bangs in her chest, it signifies her heart connecting with Nkule's, and as Matsikidze argues, Nkule becomes a more sensitive person when his heart communicates directly with Margaret's. Once more, it is important to note that no words are exchanged between the two regarding personal matters of love, but the connection is made regardless. This points to a connection that transcends normal expectations, where no words are needed to communicate because the two are connected at a higher level that does not require words for expression. Margaret's agency is further witnessed through her disruptive presence, which sees people in powerful positions locking horns as some try to sabotage and humiliate her, while others try to save and protect her. When the principal at her school, Pete, discovers that Margaret is Musaba, he tries to get rid of her, but his efforts are unsuccessful because powerful people in the village intervene. He begins by inciting a young boy to challenge Margaret's presence at the school, but Nkule, a fellow teacher of royal descent, thwarts his plans when she reprimands the class for their disrespectful behavior. On learning of this, Maru, being the chief apparent, sends his subordinates to terrorize Pete and his conspirator set. It is in their mental deterioration that Margaret's disruptive presence is witnessed again. Ketu Katrak reads Margaret as a victim of male domination because even with her English education, she is still at the mercy of men who can decide to retain or dismiss her. Pete's deterioration, however, challenges Katrak's stance as it demonstrates Margaret's inner resilience in that through all the torment she has endured because of her identity as Musaba and as a woman, she has faced it without running away from it. Pete and Seth, however, do not demonstrate the same resilience that Margaret does. They both live, while she remains and does not have a mental breakdown. We also learn that people notice that Margaret has dignity and respect, which is a far cry from how the local people have perceived Basara up to this point. Margaret is placed at the level of royalty by the community when they include her among first-class teachers. The fact that the locals view themselves fortunate highlights the change of attitude to people of Margaret's tribe, Basara. The exodus of learners from Maroba to Liseling becomes highly significant in that the locals have not only changed their attitude towards Basara, which could only be in theory, but they are prepared to show this change through their actions. By moving their children, the parents are declaring their acceptance of Margaret being Musaba as she is, and unwittingly finally respond to the question, since when did a Bushi go to school, and since when is a Bushi a teacher? When all along it was unheard of any Musaba to be associated with school through learning and teaching, people now see this as a reality and stop questioning it. Instead, they embrace this new development. Next, in Margaret's speech acts are her trances. Mutsime advances that women use silence to stabilize chaos, thus protecting their private spaces from external polluting influences. The same can be said of Margaret to a certain degree. When she is taunted by the boy in her class, questioning how being a bushman she could be a teacher, we learn that the room heaved a little, and the whole classroom of children blanked out before her, yet she still stood upright with wide open eyes. Margaret's silence and inaction should not be misconstrued as succumbing to subjugation. Rather, it should be read from Mutsime's perspective. Margaret reacts by transcending into another level of existence where she protects her private mental space from external destabilizing chaos of the insult and subsequent humiliation. Unlike during a Basara ritualistic dance where the trance is self-induced, Margaret's trance is an instinctive reaction to the pressure of oppression. While she does not protest vocally against the insult by the school child, by going into the trance, she finds a way of handling the situation. Her silence and frozen stature may be interpreted as importance. However, based on the reaction of the little girl in front, it is evident that the effects of what happens in the other level of existence are felt in reality. The choking may have been in Margaret's trance, however, the little girl does feel the effect. Margaret's trance is a reflection of her desire to attack the children who are laughing at her humiliation and a recreation of a different imaginary context in which she directly challenges her subjugation. Margaret's ultimate victory over male domination is through her dreams in her controversial marriage to Maru, which Katrak problematizes as reinscribing the female protagonist within patriarchal boundaries. This stance could be based on the knowledge that Margaret seemed to have developed feelings for Muleka, and when Maru manipulates events to keep them apart, he steps in to console Margaret. The marriage is therefore viewed more as an abduction, hence Katrak's reading. What prevents this marriage from being a symbol of female domination is Margaret's dream, which she unwittingly shares with Maru, since they are connected at psychic level. In this dream, she shows her feelings for Muleka, whom Maru already thinks is out of the picture. Colette Goldman argues that by not recalling her dreams of Muleka, Margaret unwittingly prevents total domination by Maru. The dream circumscribes Maru's power over Margaret in the most significant manner. It is agency given to the character by the author, because Margaret is not even aware of this dream on waking up. This erasure of a part of Margaret's dream makes it difficult for Maru to confront her about her affection for Muleka. And in this remaining unchallenged, Margaret unwittingly mitigates Maru's control over her. In isiZulu we say isinabuva liyabuva, which loosely translated means the last to dance gets the best audience. The closest in English proverbs is he who loves last the best. I prefer this Zulu proverb because of the positive connotation and underlying encouragement that even if one does not succeed at first, things will ultimately turn out well. This proverb is applicable to Margaret because she starts off as a victim of domination from infancy, but ultimately mitigates her victimhood through her agentic silence.
Super. Thank you, Amy. So now we'll have Mabaso. The title is Speaking Through the Silences of Rachel Weekend and Reconfiguration of the Everyday.
Hi, good afternoon. So this is the book that I'm speaking about. And I suppose I just wanted to tell you how I came to read this book, because it informs many of the issues and the questions that I have as I read through it. I think more than anything, the image on the cover is what attracted me to the book. And it's very striking. And then I wondered what Brett Michael Innes could possibly have to say about this woman. I mean, how would he be telling her story? What story could he possibly tell of her? And it's an interest that I've had in other texts that I've taught, and the ones that I always remember when I need to is Andre Brink's Other Lives, where he, as the author, writes about three characters, white men, who wake up and discover that they're black. And he writes their black experiences. It wasn't very well received. I taught those texts. It wasn't very well received by my students because I think it touched on on issues that are very close to home in our everyday and how we relate as different races. If there's anything that he succeeded in doing with that text is to force us to look at ourselves and to ask the difficult questions, particularly about the black man, which he centers in those stories. And the other one is Michiel Haynes, white male author, and his characters that he voices in that novel, titled Bodies Politic, three white women at the turn of the century who were involved in the suffragette movement. So this book also kind of carries that interest of mine, that how does Brett Michael Innes write about Rachel? Rachel is a Mozambican woman who comes to South Africa to work as a domestic worker for a white couple, Michelle and Chris Jordan. And what kind of holds them together, what imprisons them, is a web of guilt, culpability because her daughter dies at the hands of Michelle Jordan. So I'm going to read some of what I wrote and I'll speak to some of it as well. Brent Michael Innes' novel, titled Rachel Weeping, details the uneasy relationship between a domestic worker, Rachel, and her employees after the death of her child under her employer's care. Innes describes the book as a narrative about class. Hang on, am I reading to you my abstract? Yes. Yes, that's my abstract, yes. So the author centers the story of Rachel, who is a domestic worker, and explores how guilt, grief and resentment change not only the dynamics of power in their lives and the Jordan household, but also of the ways in which voicing of these emotions takes place. The novel's prologue introduces the reader to a pregnant Rachel, who is about to leave for South Africa as a domestic worker, and acquaints us with her emotions, her hopes, and her regrets. The prologue firmly ensconces Rachel as the figure we carry into the story. And the prologue, the very first sentence of the prologue begins, "This could be the last time I'm here." I suppose I should also just note that I teach narratology, so that's always my way into looking at texts. How is the book structured? Who do we encounter first? And how does the prologue function in each case? And I suppose what Innes does in this book is to center Rachel in a way that I suppose, not that it doesn't in the rest of the narrative, but is to say this is the person that I'm asking you to take with you as I started the story of these three people. So the prologue functions not only to tell us about her life before she joins this family, before she comes to work with them, but also that is the person, the figure that we carry into the very first sentence of the story. Thus the very first line of the prologue indicates transitions, journeys, and not only geographically, but also morally for all of the three adults in the story. The prologue, for me, personally, is also how I start to untangle, trying to come up with a response to the question, how does Innes tell the story of a female immigrant worker whose struggles aren't just bread and butter, but potentially life-threatening as a Mozambican female domestic worker, who has to every day come up against accusations that she's taking away jobs and opportunities from the locals. So structurally, in plotting the story, the prologue is one way of signaling whose life the author chooses to foreground, or whose life is foregrounded in this narrative, and somebody of whom we already have knowledge when we get to the first chapter. My question at the start of my research was, how successful is narrative perspective, and by extension, authorial perspective, in telling the story of a grieving domestic worker from Mozambique? How does he succeed in treating this woman's story with respect? And I also have to footnote here that that is constant preoccupation I have from my ex-colleague, Professor Grace Musila, who likes to look at ways in which authors show and demonstrate respect for their characters, whether their characters are suffering, are poor, whatever state they might be in, but then how does an author show respect for that character? So I was wondering, I was extending that question to her. It's something I do in all my lectures. I ask my students that we have to discern how this author treats his characters with respect. I don't think Professor Musila does it, but I do it for every class and every text that I teach. And I don't know if I found the answers to that question yet. However, the questions that I have of this novel have changed in the course of reading the novel. My focus became the relationship of the characters, how there is so much to say between them, but how unable they are to speak to each other. So my question is slowly becoming one along the lines of, how does Ines use silence as an organizing concept in the novel? How does Michelle Jordan speak when she cannot find the words to talk to Rachel, to ask for forgiveness, to talk about the child that she's responsible for having led to her death? When her own growing pregnancy stands as testament to the loss of Rachel's child at her own hands. What does it say about that respect, the one that I'm looking for from the author, when Rachel uses silence and an emotionless face to mask the rage, the grief, and the accusatory finger that she points at her employers? If she won't verbalize her emotions, what language does Ines give her to assert her grief, to convey the complexity of choosing to continue working for the Jordans because of the family that she needs to keep supporting back in Mozambique? What character does she then become in his hands? And some of the most striking narrative devices that he uses in response to these questions to hold these lives together, not only to hold the story and the plot together, but the lives, is the use of presence and absence. Rachel's daughter Maya is already dead in chapter 1, but the story's progression is broken up by memories of a daily life with her mother. Rachel thinks back to what they used to do in the mornings together. So what the author does is to detail the mundane, what do they do on waking up? Those very mundane actions of waking up a child to get ready for school and the child getting back to sleep and then having to wake the child up again, which when I first read the book were just extra detail. I needed to get to the point. Because revelation is a big part of any novel. What is the point that this story is working towards? What is the plot moving towards? The plot is not moving towards the death of the child, because I already know that, or how she died, because the hints are dropped along the novel. But actually it's about these three lives and the silences and how they speak, because that tends to dominate the novel more than what happened, but is what's happening now post the tragedy that they're all living through. So there's presences and there's absences, and also the use of borders in different ways, because this is a story about an immigrant, and that also lends itself to the charting of the story of the domestic space, what happens between these three characters in the house, between the main house and the domestic quarters, who is in and who's out, and what does being in mean in this case? Because if you as the master and the mistress of the house that have given this woman employment hold all the power, and then all of a sudden the power is subverted, and you're responsible for killing this woman's child, and she chooses, actually, I'm not going to stop working for you, I'm going to continue working, which is something they hadn't prepared themselves for. So power dynamics shift in very, very obvious ways. The Jordans are unable to move in their house as they wish. Michelle confines herself to spaces when Rachel is in the house because she can't find the words to talk about the issue between them. So the story becomes about exploring how they speak about what happened and how they find an outlet for the grief that all of them are experiencing in different ways. There's a lot that the book also does. You know, it's also a book of objects. I find that Brett Michael Innes uses the everyday objects to draw stark contrast in their lives, which is something that I found Cindy Magona did very well in her book about, what's that book about? Pardon? Yes, Mother to Mother. Where in one hand she describes what was happening in the life of the child in the township and the life of the other child in suburbia, and then how those two very different lives, how their mornings began, and then how their lives collide. So Brett Michael Innes also uses the everyday objects. So whereas Rachel's life is full of, her life is actually in a tin box where she keeps, you know, a shell that she picked up from the beach, and it holds memories of home for her. She keeps a ring that she picked up that she will go pawn the day that she needs money. So it's a treasure box. Whereas the language that is used to describe the lives of the Jordans, it's about their cars. You know, the husband is an architect, the woman works in marketing. So Rachel always rages that they have more money than she knows, than they know what to do with, while she's forced to work for them so that she's able to send money home. So there's a lot that's happening. But I think I'm just going to read some of the example. Also with regard to borders, I find that morality becomes a very fluid line, because as a result of her rage, Rachel then commits certain acts which she would never have done before, but now she feels that she can, because after all, you killed my child, you know. She steals money from them. She comes across Rachel's purse, it's sitting on the table, it's open, she goes, she looks, she sees notes and she takes one, she stuffs it in a pocket and she walks away thinking, you know, it's nothing, you know, she just plays with the dog afterwards. She doesn't feel guilt at having done that. And so their lives are intertwined, and the author refuses to give any of them an out of this triangle that they're in. All of them come across memories of the child, and they don't share any of their grief with each other. Michelle feels that she blames herself, she shuts herself in the room and she cries by herself. Her husband goes to clean out the pool because the machine is stuck, and he finds the child's doll in the machine, and you know it breaks down his entire evening. But none of them voice this grief to each other. It comes out as bursts of anger which the others don't understand, I suppose. So there's hectic silences that they experience individually. But the author doesn't give them room to voice, doesn't give them an outlet. And I suppose it's also a device for moving the story forward, because those silences carry the story in a way that, you know, confrontation and working through would have allowed him to the eventual revelation, which turns out not to be how the child died, but the fact that Rachel decides to help Michelle when she's having difficulty giving birth to her own child. She decides, you know what, I could let you lose that child, but I won't be that person. She helps her, but then she also takes money from them, and that's how they part, you know. I feel that the ending is part of that respect. It satisfies me personally, but I'm not sure that once I start to theorize what's going on in the novel, it'll be a satisfying ending. It satisfies me that she's able to help. She doesn't just watch another woman. Okay, oh, someone be able to bring from the okay, so there's a lot that's happening, but I find that it's the silences that that imprison these three characters, but it's also the silences used as a narrative device that carry the story along. And also how then, if there's all these silences, what language does it give them to speak? Those moments of accusation, those moments of outbursts, are also part of what give the plot progression. Okay. I find that in an attempt to answer my question about authorial respect for the characters, I move from my own reaction to the blurring line of morality where Rachel is concerned. She steals, she takes. There's a moment when there's a baby shower in the house and somebody summons her like that, just take the dishes away. She takes the dishes away because she's always, a blank face, but there's so much happening behind. And when she gets to the passage, she just drops everything. It's not by accident, it's very intentional. And she knows it, and I think Michelle also knows it, although the guests don't know it. So those moments when they're able to decode each other's actions because they know more than anybody else the daily struggle of living together in silence in this house, what it means. So I feel that there is a lot of respect that Michael Innes gives the character, because even through the blurred morality, I find that I'm not as judgmental of her, but I don't know once I start theorizing. Okay, so in closing, which is not my conclusion but now is, Buleng Hanong asserts that the female voice remains under stress in a changing socio-political public sphere. While the participation of black females in politics and business is evident, the cultural sphere remains challenging and not as quick to consider different ways of embracing female empowerment and encouraging visibility. Hanong views gender and voice as discursively constructed through socially negotiated meanings, and the cultural context as being one of the major determinants of these constructions. And then I'm taking this, I'm starting to read up on, studies on domestic workers, because there's invisible, I think that's us, and then there's domestic workers. That's another level of invisibility, which is why I was also so interested in this study. Time up. And then I also talk about Mtabi Singh Mutseve's various meanings of silence. And I suppose I will end on this. The question becomes, what responsibilities does this novel have in providing a platform for the silence to be broken? Silences around domestic workers, and we know the stories just from newspapers. What silences does it break? Does it provide the space for healing to take place? And not the kumbaya type of healing, but what kinds of healings are we looking at? In Lengbe, the underlying social and cultural framework that repeatedly make these kinds of silencing possible. My question is, how successful is Innes in making audible the voice of that marginalized class, the domestic workers, and how narratologically does it do that? Does it give Rachel a voice, and does it still give her respect at the same time? So those are just some of the questions I'm asking.
So we have 10 minutes for some questions, if there is any that you'd like to pose. We also have Okay, super, please.
Sorry, I didn't have a moment to look over them, but I have circled, so it might be a little bit discombobulated.
Well, you can take your time to put it together, and I'll just pose one in the meantime.
Okay, great,
Sure.
thanks.
So, yeah, maybe I was looking at your presentation now, was touching very much on what I'm saying this morning, an agreement addressed about silence as an articulation of despair. And so how, I mean, in the one instance you say that when she drops the tray, this is how we hear it, but how else do we find it, or how do we say it?
You know, her power isn't being silent. Her power is in being there and presenting this face that's just blank. It's mentioned so many times, but also the fact that there's so much happening behind that mask. So for me, that was, I had to decide, you know, do I think it's perverse what she's doing? I understand why she needs to be with this family, because she won't get to work that is as well remunerated as with this couple. But she's also aware. So I'm looking at agency, you know. She's making choices, and even though sometimes it might feel like she doesn't have any choice, she is making choices. She's chosen, I'm going to torture them with my mute face.
Then what happens to the agency when she then leaves? Because in the end she leaves, so they never have to confront
her again.
other situations. It kind of just disappears. So the things that were never said, they never have to live with.
To be said. I find that there's a lot that they understand is being said. In her helping Michelle she's struggling, to give birth. You know, it's a premature birth. And she's at home, she's not at the hospital. So and the way that the chapters are juxtaposed are just like, as Michelle is struggling with giving birth, we're reading about how she was on the phone with her mother that fateful day and the child was busy drowning. So it's kind of the same kinds of, they understand without it being said. I feel that in juxtaposing those chapters like that, the author is in a way telling us that these are the understandings that these women have. She helps her give birth. She takes, I think, about 1,000 rand from their money, and then she goes home because her father needs money urgently for a medical treatment. But it's with the understanding that all sins forgiven, all debts paid up, and I leave with my daughter, the ashes of her daughter in my hand. So I suppose it's a very satisfying ending for the reader, more than it is perhaps for them. But for yes, yeah, I needed them to end in that way, because I needed her to redeem herself for stealing and for all the other things that she does.
So we'll take it.
Okay. So the question I have a question for each speaker. The first one is I wondered how their rearticulations, it was one of the last points that you made, that the mothers and the grandmothers rearticulated their narratives through trauma, sexuality, and mothering. And my question is I'm just curious, you said you didn't have time to do it, so how do they frame these? And then just a tangential question to that, does religion figure at all in that? Because as you were speaking, of course, my grandmother is Xhosa and from the Eastern Cape. And I remember just before her passing, trying to, I'm very much interested in the history of our knowledge and what we passed down. And I was constantly trying to engage her in, what was your experience of violence and trauma and apartheid? And she just never spoke about it. It was never, and within my family, it's never spoken about. Although there were a few members who were very active and quite a number of disappearances and stuff. So I'm just, and she really fell back on religion quite a lot. So I wondered if religion did it figure in these stories. And then there's a link that I thought between Lungelwa's presentation and yours, Taryn, about affect theory and pain. and whether somehow I've only read parts of Bessie Head's novel, so yeah, it was such an excellent reading of it. And I guess my question actually to that, well, I haven't really thought through between the affect theory and pain thing, but the question that I have for you is, I don't know, I'm very cautious of the presentation of black women as these strong, silent warriors who carry so much pain, and it's through their silences that they, it's almost like not a celebration, but an honorarium of us as warriors. You strike a rock, you strike a woman. It's that, no, actually, we have flesh and we bleed and we cry. And so I wondered if, is there an escape in your reading that we don't get to figure her as a, resilient, and the resilient black body, which is kind of also the question that I have for Nabisa is that whole thing about forgiveness as redemptive, and should we always? I know it's the narrative in South Africa that we, forgive, and part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, forgive, and after that you will be released from your pain. And so after, I haven't also read that novel. So when she leaves, is there, because she's now birthing this other, and I'm sure there's race dynamics in that, so she's birthing this white woman's baby, and is that where she gets to have her redemption? And for me, I haven't read it, but I'm just like, do we then see her as this, wow, she's so amazing, you've lost your baby and now you're giving birth to another woman, the woman who killed your babies, and then we're like, wow, you're so amazing for doing that, and then all she's given is the material possession of like stealing. Is she actually even stealing if maybe they're underpaying her? Like, is it okay, that's I'm done.
Okay. So in response to the rearticulations, primarily gendered rearticulations. So you can see the links between the personal stories, the loss of men, and then the way in which they talk with the next generation as being, well, don't get involved with men, that men bring trouble, and it's rearticulated in the sense that it's also aligned with current experiences of violence, gendered violence, HIV. So there's this kind of like, we talk about those things, but it's got this sort of historical root, like it's got this kind of like connection in this indirect kind of way. So we talk about the past, but we're not actually using the language of the past. And it's very gendered. It's around mothering, it's around sexuality, it's around respect, it's those kinds of things. And then the grandmothers spoke a lot about religion in their own lives, but not in the generational talk. There seems to be like a disconnect in that sense. But what's interesting is in the project with young people, they then talk about the generational force to be religious and to go to church with grandmothers. So it's interesting that the grandmothers don't feel that that's a kind of connection that they have with the younger generation, but the young people do. So there's a difference, and I'm interested to map those out in sort of future unpacking of this stuff. But very much the effective stuff. I mean, these women carry the pain as if it is, if it's happened yesterday. So it's a very embodied experience. It's very, it's still very raw, and I think that affects the talk, because they don't want to share that pain with their children. They don't want their kids to feel that kind of sense of what has happened.
Okay. In respect to the very rising of silence, as how you see the paper, I just want to say that the focus was more on showing that even in passivity, there still can be resistance, and it doesn't mean that when a person is passive, that's always a sign of acceptance. And that is mainly because in most cases when people think, I'm overgeneralizing, but when people think of agency, they think of being militant, being aggressive. And what I'm trying to show through this is the fact that even in the silences, there still is a way of fighting back, even if it's intentionality aside, okay? But then when it comes to how something that we could take away, especially for a modern day kind of audience thinker, or even for just the general public, is the fact that Margaret in the public space uses her brains without intending or planning to do so. She uses her brains to break away from the stereotype of what Musarwa is. In the text, we are told of how they are dirty, uncombed her, and not educated, and that is where the challenge keeps coming from when she's a child, that other primary school children don't understand why is she at school because she's a bushman. As an adult, again, she faces the same. Why are you here? Because you are Musarwa. And she actually, I did not get to that point because that's when she is not silent. She declares that she is Musarwa unashamedly. Even when she's given an option to assume a colored identity, she does not take that. And it's in that choice that she makes to remain Musarwa despite being a subjugated tribe that I find her strength to be. Because she embraces that, and in so doing, she's saying to all the other oppressed people out there, be who you are, and do not compromise, and do not be ashamed of being that. Even when people give you an option to be something that they accept as better, stay true to who you are, and in that way you'll get others to also feel open about their identity. And in this case, the Basarwa who get to know that there is now an educated Musarwa. And in the text, you get to know that she came top of her class. That's why I'm saying she used her brains to advance and not just relied on the fact that she had been adopted by this white missionary couple, but she actually uses her brains to succeed. And then as an adult, she also, in the text, I mentioned how the community are happy that she is at that school, and they move their children from one to where she is because they see that she is nothing like what they have assumed Basarwa to be. And in that being a role model of that sort, I feel that's another form of her agency being exercised. Because this is just a section of the bigger study. In the bigger study, I not only look at the reflexive agency, but I also look at Ubuntu as agency, where what she does not only benefit herself, but others also benefit from, and what others do also help her to benefit. But I also look at the few incidences where then she is a proactive agent, like when she declares her identity that I am myself.
Okay, with regards to forgiveness being necessary for redemption, I think there's a lot of me in how I read what's going on, but I think also the author is presenting that as necessary for her, because as long as she's still feeling angry and is raging silently against them, it's complicating her life also. It's something that's eating away at her. She has these moments when she's just immobile with grief and she can't do anything about it. She can't talk to somebody, she can't talk it through, all the things that we think people who are grieving should do, talk to somebody. So the book presents it as such, that as long as she's still raging inside her, she's unsettled, she doesn't have closure. And then ultimately at the end, once it's resolved, once she's been able to let go of her anger and her hurt, she's able to take the ashes of her child back home to Zimbabwe with the money that she took. So I haven't been able to get past that teaching that you need to forgive to release your own self, because I think also the book presents it as such. And as I was reading, I thought of a conversation I had with a colleague about people who steal, poor people who steal. And her point of contention was, why shouldn't they steal? When I was saying that, not all poor people are thieves, and she said, but why aren't they all thieves? Because they should be thieves. What are we expecting them to live on? And I think that kind of thought, I remember that conversation of when she was stealing, that why am I embarrassed that she's stealing? And she's not underpaid, she's very well paid, but she's still a domestic. There's still power dynamics. People can click their fingers to summon her. So some of these questions the books just tosses up and doesn't answer them, and so I want to answer them for myself, and I wanted to find redemption somehow. And that's why I'm saying that now that I'm going to do the difficult work of theorizing about, and I don't even want to think of how I'm going to start with the feminist reading of this book about a Mozambican worker in South Africa that's written by a white male South African, and what it's like the previous panel when she has to, once feminist about a particular sound, she tries to stay away from answering the question. But I'll see where I come out. But a lot of that is about my own need to redeem her and release her from suffering. And I suppose that's also part of how I teach and read texts, always aware of the dynamic between the reader and the author and the character. So I'm very aware of what I impose on the reading, and your question has a lot to do with what I impose on the reading. I want the forgiveness, I want the redemption.
Okay.
Great. Any more questions? I think we're here for another 2 days. We can just catch them and pose the question. And thank you for staying to the session.